This is a test. This station is conducting a test of the emergency broadcast system. This is only a test.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Thunderpud number 2, coming to you from the rabbit hole, and I'm proud to present the 4th volume of the Good News with the Reverend Doctor. I turn you over now to your co-host, Agent C.
Thank you so much, and welcome back, everybody. Well, I believe we've got an incredible show in front of us today.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. This one's going to be one for the record books, because we're making history today.
Reverend Doctor, how are you today?
I'm great as always.
Good deal.
It's good to have you here, brother. Thank you for
very
being
much.
here.
It's been an interesting week.
Yes.
It has.
I would like to go into, well, first of all, we would like to welcome our guest for today.
Yes. The first time we've had a guest here on the Good News.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good friend of ours, of mine and the agencies we've known for years. This woman reached out, a few weeks ago. It's like, I love the Good News with the Reverend Doctor. I'm a fan of the show. And I'm like, well, have you ever thought about coming on? Because you're and the Reverend are probably the two smartest people I know.
Absolutely.
So I've
Oh,
always...
you don't mean that.
No, we definitely mean that.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, we definitely mean that.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
You don't know some of the people me and agency know. Cara Hayes absolutely does know some of the people that we know, so
Yes.
I think she could probably, verify that statement.
Yes.
But Cara Hayes, thank you for being here. You and the Reverend have similar backgrounds as far as your education, as far as both being history majors, being your primary education. So today we're going to look into hidden history, something maybe that we don't see every day, something you don't see necessarily in the school books,
Right.
but some that's out there. So,
But before we get into that,
I was
would
just
like
about to say before we get into that.
oh yeah.
in the news, some more Michael Jackson revelations.
Yes.
That is correct. Yes,
Reverend Doctor, do you mind?
Well, let's see. Was this Wednesday or Tuesday it came out on?
I think it was Wednesday.
So there's been some investigation that's been done into the documentary Leaving Neverland. I can't remember the name of the director off the top of my head, but there was an independent investigation that somebody did where the county that Neverland Ranch was built, the deeds and the records were pulled, and apparently at the time when James Safechuck, one of the two accusers, claims that the abuse was going on, Neverland Ranch wasn't even built yet.
Right. So he was claiming that these actions or these situations happened in the train station, I believe it was, at Neverland, and the train station hadn't been even built.
He claimed it was going on all over, like in every room of the house.
That's right.
And the director has since backtracked on this and said
Dan Reed.
Yeah, Dan Reed. He has since backtracked and said, well, this doesn't make it less true. It just means that the, quote, child abuse was going on, 2 to 3 years down the line. So he would have been, 16, 17, 18.
Right. Well, very late.
Yeah, kind of throws
A little late to be child abuse, but
right. And those years are pretty formative, man. I mean, you remember the ages between 12 to 16. I mean, that.
Yeah.
So it kind of threw a little bit of a monkey wrench in some of the narrative. Is basically
Not to say that there couldn't be abuse at that point, but
well, there can always be abusive dynamics in relationships, but we kind of have to talk for a second about how big of a years in difference those are. The difference between 12 and 16 or 17, that's only 4 years.
Right.
But that's very different from, say, 25 to 29.
Thank you. Exactly.
Or
exactly.
23 to 26.
Exactly.
Those are huge years.
Right.
it just doesn't fit this model that he's been patterned after.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
As far as the age range, as far as his victims,
Right.
You would say.
Well, and part of one of the things I said last time we were here was that when, Corey Feldman says that MJ didn't abuse him, I believe him.
I do.
Right.
I do
Because
as well.
they didn't start hanging out together until he was 16, 17 years
Right.
old, which appears to be way past the point that Jackson had any pattern of being interested in. And
Right.
for all intents and purposes, it seems like they were just friends who bonded over having bad showbiz childhoods.
Right.
Right.
I mean, even with Macaulay Culkin, I believe him when he says he was never abused. I watched him on the Rogan show. They brought it up. I mean, to me, he looked like he was very sincere, you know, and I don't doubt him at all. Why would he lie about that?
Well,
you know?
at any point he could have.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, yeah. I mean, once again, you know, as we talked in the last time we were all here, personally, I think that there was something going on because I just don't see how somebody in the Michael Jackson camp never stood up and said, "Hey, even though I know you have innocent intentions, you cannot be sleeping with these children in your somebody at some point had." With his circle and the people that he had surrounding him, at least one person would be like, "Hey, Michael, that's fucking weird, man. Don't do that."
It seems like there were, but you know, a big point we have to get at is that there's been a lot of Jackson's defenders who have come out online in the past several weeks about this, who have come out against the documentary and all the accusations, not just the Jackson family. And it seems like, you know, if we're going to say he's innocent, it's like, what is he innocent of?
Right.
Because there's nobody that denies, even the family, that he had sleepovers with
Right.
young boys.
Yes,
Yeah.
correct, right.
And did this. And that's probably indicative of a lot of other shit, too.
Right.
That happened. You know, there's nobody. To me, the most damning piece of evidence is that, you know, no matter whose testimony you want to go out against, like, for example, not this Safe Chuck guy, but the other one, Robson. Right. There's been Michael Jackson's lawyer who did an interview talking about him, and he goes, "This just doesn't fit the pattern that I see, because this was a guy who broke up Britney Spears and Justin Timberlake.
Yeah.
This isn't like
Right.
some super shell-shocked kid. I mean, that is like extreme level confidence."
Right,
Right.
because, I mean, this man is already a success. He's already, I mean, man, he slept with Britney Spears. I mean, I think every man out there listening knows that this guy came up.
Yeah.
I mean, for real, you know, he's successful. He did what he wanted to do for a living and made a great living. Why would he come out all these years later?
Well, to me, the most damning piece of evidence of all is that the 1993 accuser, when he was under deposition in a police interview, he was asked to draw a picture of Jackson's genitals and include the vitiligo, the birthmarks, the moles, everything.
Right.
And when he did, it was considered so ironclad and so damning that was when the cash offering was put up. They said, because Jackson's lawyer said, "We're going to offer you $25 million because if this goes to trial, we're going to lose and Jackson's going to go to jail."
And I remember when that happened in '93. That was the one thing that really caught my attention, is when that kid described his penis, including birthmarks. You know, it definitely had its own characteristics.
Yeah, to me, that's the most damning piece of evidence, and nobody's hit out against that because there really doesn't seem to be any defense from it.
No, now and
It's just
obviously
so strange. I've always thought it's so strange. I don't know. That's a weird thing for a kid to remember. I won't say that it's not. I couldn't even tell you stuff about myself for the 43 years.
and you've had hands-on, and he's had hands-on experience. You know,
I'm being serious.
Yeah, sure.
I couldn't tell you exactly what. Could you with a partner?
what you mean? Describe my penis?
Yeah, or even with a partner that you've been with, or anybody you've been in contact with intimately.
I've never had any partners with penises.
No, I'm talking about just. See, he's turning it. This is not that other show.
Okay, that's tomorrow.
Yeah, that's tomorrow.
Okay.
But anybody you've been intimate with, could you describe them?
I mean, possibly.
Maybe.
But see, I think it comes down to the trauma. Because it was, I mean, to me, for a little kid, that's a traumatic thing. And that sort of imprints it into their minds. And especially if you're seeing it more than once, which, he
I was just about to
probably
say,
was.
if it's the only one you've ever seen, and if it's deformed.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And I think we can all remember our first times, losing our virginity, our first sexual experience. I mean, I was, 19, and I can remember it pretty vividly. I remember the entire time. Were you drunk at the time?
No. I just flash.
Really?
It was just a flash.
Over in an instant.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to hear that for her.
Yeah. But yeah, it wasn't.
We send our condolences.
It wasn't, where I'm, taking, the pictures for the memory bank.
Right.
With the eye flashes. Like, okay, I remember every bit of this.
I remember mine pretty vividly. But what I was going to say as far as Michael Jackson. If you want to get more in depth with this, subject, go back and listen to our Leaving Neverland presentation.
Yes. Yeah,
we go
please
into
do.
a lot of detail about it because I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that because
this is a whole nother,
absolutely
a whole nother episode,
which we may do another special presentation to
some point down
follow
the line.
up with it. Because today I want to talk about something that both our guests are very familiar with, and that is not just history, but hidden history. History, like I said a little earlier, that we don't get to see in the school books. Stuff you have to kind of go looking for. And we're going to have basically two segments today. The first part of this show, we're going to talk more about ancient hidden history, like pre-flood biblical history. And then in the second half, we're going to go into a little bit more modern era with some of the Hitler conspiracies that we've heard. Obviously, that's going to be for the second part of our show. But to start out, I know Reverend Doctor, you are, you have a big interest in pre-flood history. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
And I do as well. That's one of my more favorite quote-unquote conspiracy theories, the Book of Enoch, the Nephilim, Watchers, things of this nature. Reverend, do you want to kind of put it out there?
Well, question, have you read the Book of Enoch?
No, I have not. No.
Anybody?
No.
I started to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you get far?
Chapter, I think it was still in the first section, the way that they had it laid out.
Right. Okay.
It still kind of blew my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so where do you want to start?
I say let's start at the very beginning, brother. Oh, let there be light.
Yes.
Let there be light.
Or water.
There
Very good.
There you go.
So, I've always found it really interesting when we talk about the flood or the antediluvian period, how there's a common mythology in basically every culture you're going to see in the world that has some account of not just a flood happening, but of there being a race of giants that walks the earth.
Right.
So, what's your take?
So my first degree is in English. So of course I've read a whole mess of stuff. But the one thing that really, in terms of this topic, sticks in my mind was the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
And I remember, of course, I was very sheltered. I would consider myself very sheltered growing up. And I wasn't exposed to a whole lot. My experiences were small. And I remember thinking, when I had to read this for a class, I just thought, wait, there's more than one story like this? I thought there was only one.
Right.
And that sort of just blew my mind. And then I started, sort of learning that there was this same story in all of these other cultures. Right. And, that your brain just kind of expands a little bit and you think, why?
That's one of the things that is really interesting about the Old Testament is how it's not really until we get to the book of Exodus that you see stories that are unique just to the Jewish people in the Hebrew context, that when you go back to Genesis, a lot of these stories seem like myths that came from other cultures, that there's a great deal of precedence to them.
Right. And a lot of common threads, like we were just talking about with the flood. That was something that always interested me. These civilizations, or societies who shouldn't have any contact with each other given the geological locations, all share a flood story in some degree. Right. And that always fascinated me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. So, where would be a good place to start with, really going into the flood? I mean, this is such a broad topic that...
And it's only mentioned very briefly in the Bible. That was something that always, another thing that really kind of blew my mind is, they would just briefly in one sentence, there were Nephilim in those days. moving on.
Right.
It's like, whoa, hold on, let's back that up. Let's talk about that. I would like to maybe start with the Watchers. Maybe who the Watchers are, what, just basically an overview of that.
That's a great place to start.
Yes,
so when we begin talking about the Watchers, I guess, a thing that's really important to get out of the way first and foremost is that when we say these stories are in the Bible, people will say, well, where at? What Bible are you talking about?
Right.
And to get this out of the way at the beginning, like I said, there is no such thing as, in air quotes, the Bible. There are just Bibles.
Right.
There are numerous texts that different groups in different times and places have considered authoritative and taken out or placed precedence on and altered or used in various ways or whatever. So in the book of Genesis, it talks about this a little bit very, very briefly, where the gist we get underlying the text is that at some point there were a group of angels who saw the human women, or as it says in the text, the daughters of Seth, and came into them, and the offspring were a race of giants.
Right.
And that these giants became more and more bloodthirsty as time went on, and humans couldn't feed them anymore, so they began eating humans.
Right.
And it's also implied that there's a subcurrent going on in the story where these angels taught humans astrology, mathematics, warfare,
Agriculture.
math.
Right. Yes.
And what it says is these were secrets that were known only above and not to be known by humans.
Right. Now, let me ask you this, Reverend. Could that part of the legend or the mythology, could that also maybe bleed into just the tree of knowledge sort of mythology? In other words, by being taught all these secret things, like agriculture, medicine, math, could that kind of be tied into the tree of knowledge? Do you think?
When you talk about tree of knowledge, I have to ask what you mean by it, because different people describe it different ways.
Just the basic, I guess my basic concept of the Genesis story, the Adam and Eve story, being in the garden, and then, eating, because I know there's a tree of life and a tree of knowledge.
Well, it was the tree of knowledge that was eaten from first.
Right.
And the reason why they were thrown out of the garden in the story wasn't necessarily even because they did that. It was because that if, it was the fear that they were going to eat from the tree of immortality.
Right. So a popular misconception is that Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden for eating from the tree of knowledge.
Right.
But what it really was, because God didn't want them eating from the other tree, the tree of immortality.
Right.
Yeah.
I just learned something.
There you go. That's why we're the good news.
Indeed.
Because that's what I always thought. Oh, they ate from the tree. Boom, you're out.
No.
Wow.
Yeah, it's because they didn't want him eating from the other tree of immortality. Yes.
Yeah.
Or life, the tree of life.
Well, we could probably spend 3 or 4 whole shows or more just going into subtext within Genesis.
With that, right.
Because there's so much in the book that carries a great weight of subtext. Like there's an entire school of Hebrew thought that you see sometimes with Kabbalistic schools, but a lot of times with Orthodox or Hasidic Judaism that they call Midrash or Midrash, where it's examining the text for. I almost have to pause to collect my thoughts, because I almost have to give you a background on the Hebrew language to begin with. Hebrew and, Semitic languages, period, are what we would call rich languages.
Okay.
Meaning that they don't translate well.
Got you. I see.
Okay. Latin, Greek, the Romance languages, those are what we would call practical languages.
I see.
With Semitic languages, vowels were a late addition.
Right.
You understand what I mean? Right. Like,
and that was to help translate, correct?
Yeah, it basically just consonants. Like vowels can't come in the form of dots
Right.
in words.
And wasn't it mathematical based as well? It's the Hebrew language. Seems like I've heard that.
I mean, to a small extent, like there's a study of it, like of sacred numerology,
Yeah.
that goes into it, and that's only sort of tied in. But I almost hate to speak on it because I feel like I'm nowhere near the expert I should be. To like, I mean, I'm conversational in it, but not an expert on this by any means.
I see. I got you.
But a large part of what Midrash consists of is looking at these original texts and saying, okay, what can these words allude to? What other words do they look like?
Right.
There's an idea that if all of these books are divinely inspired, that God doesn't waste a breath. Right. So every consonant is relevant.
It counts
to something.
Right.
So they sit and argue. They've argued for forever about this, about, not just about passages and their meaning, but about what about this vowel?
I see. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, in other words, you break it down to every single detail of this language, or every single detail of whatever's written down.
Right.
I see. Well, let me ask you, Reverend, kind of keeping in line with the quote unquote conspiracy theory. Do you believe in planet Nibiru? Because it does tie in to these legends. Certain people believe that Nibiru. Well, let me tell you what I've heard and see what you guys think about this.
Are you talking like 2012, like Sitchin type stuff?
Starting to get there a little bit, yes. But I believe it was actually Lloyd who you posted
Lloyd Pye.
Yes. Yeah, I watched about 45, 50 minutes of that video, and I need to finish it. I had to go to sleep. I had to go to bed.
He makes a great case for Bigfoot.
Wow. Yes, he does.
Yeah.
Did you watch some of that Agency? That was insane. But what I really, was interested in was the story of planet Nibiru and how it collided with another planet. I believe it was actually supposed to be Earth, prehistoric Earth. And that's what created the Earth and the asteroid belt. And that the inhabitants of Nibiru are actually our ancestors, human beings. Do you buy in any of that? Or what's your take on all that, Reverend?
I honestly don't know.
Okay. I know it's very fantastic.
And I don't mean I'm ignorant of the subject. I mean, I don't know.
It's a very fantastical story. That was the one that really, to me, was fascinating. Just to hear... And then how Nibiru's making its cycle back around, and will be back in our atmosphere or back in our where we can observe it in about 120 years or something like that. Yeah.
Like, do you believe in the theory of panspermia based existence? Like, what I mean by that is where an asteroid carrying alien DNA from another planet hits another planet and colonizes it. Yeah. That's what they mean by panspermia.
Right. I once again, I don't know. I think it's absolutely possible. I'm from the mindset that anything's possible. I've always been of that mindset. Well, I tell you, let's get back on track. I just had to throw that one out there. So we haven't even hit the flood yet. So we're still, kind of talking about the Watchers and the Giants and all that. So let's pick back up on that. Well, first of all, Cara's over here looking like, what the hell? What's your take so far on all this stuff, Cara? That's a perfect response.
Yeah.
It gets pretty mind-blowing. It gets pretty, like I say, fantastical. All right, so let's get back into some of the Giants and some of this stuff, with the Watchers. And
okay, well, one of the most interesting theories I've always had about this, or seen written pretty broadly about it, is in the book of Genesis. It talks about there being the sky separating the waters below from the waters above.
Right.
This is
it's in there.
Yeah,
it's in the Bible.
It's in there. Yeah. So there has been. This is like one of these grand unifying theories where it looks at a lot of things from all over the place, like why. Well, I'll shelve that for a little bit down the line. I'm still trying to gather my thoughts on this one, but talk.
Well, I was going to say I definitely want to get into that because me and Agent C on the way over here was talking exactly about that, about the other water layer that they talk about. I tell you what, Reverend, once you explain to Agent C and Cara let's just talk about dinosaurs, for instance, because that was the part that really, really fascinated me when we were talking about this a few weeks ago.
Okay. Well, there's a belief that that became really popular with biblical literalists back around the mid 1800s, I guess. And for a while, in the early part of the 1900s, these became less popular and were sort of embraced as or not embraced, but rejected as quack theories.
Right.
But there's been some interesting science that's come up in the years since that suggests there could be something to it. This might not entirely be bullshit. Right. And what it talks about is that at some point in time in our planet's past, there was a layer of water that surrounded the Earth or the sky that could have been like a byproduct of the planet's formation. And that this is what was called the firmament.
Right.
I guess. Well, one of the things that would have happened as a scientific byproduct of this was it would have jacked up oxygen levels so high that it would have enabled insects, birds, animals, and humans, presumably, to live extraordinarily long lives and grow to insanely tall heights,
which would explain the biblical stories of how people would live to be hundreds and hundreds of years old, and it would also explain the dinosaurs, which would just be reptiles who grew exceptionally large, because reptiles don't stop growing.
Reptiles never stop growing
as long as they have that oxygen and that the means to grow.
They will grow until they die.
You're right. In other words, there's no cause. Right. They don't cap out, basically.
Yeah.
But now, given that theory would be the truth, let's just say it is, and that would absolutely explain why reptiles grew massive. It also would explain why people live to be 300-400 years old.
Yeah, and so what comes about from this is that there's a belief that at some point in time there was this cataclysmic event that was the flood, which was essentially this firmament or hydrosphere collapsing.
And flooding the earth.
Flooded the earth, created the majority of the oceans, all that. And when it collapsed,
it broke up.
Living creatures were no longer able to live to these lengths anymore.
Exactly. And it would also explain how we had that one landmass, the name's
Pangea.
Thank you. Yes, and then how it would split up.
Yeah, and there's a lot of interesting overlapping mythology with when you look at ancient cultures, how kings who were considered god kings during their time were illustrated as aquatic imagery, like the king Ea, or spelled Ea or Ia, that a lot of this mythology originally stems from, but also with Sargon of Akkad, with Dagon, who later became a god down the line. And Christ being illustrated as a fish is an overlap from this period, but it was believed that aquatic creatures occupied some space that was in between mortal and divine, that they were from some sort of in-between world.
Right.
And there's even been some theoretical ideas behind this, like how one theory has always stated that when people stood on the banks of the Mediterranean or the Red Sea and they looked out at the horizon, they saw the sea as being this in-between space between the sky and the land.
Right.
But there's this apparently way older theory, which I only learned about several years back when I began reading into this, that says that this came from the waters being in the sky,
which would also explain the flood.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that's pretty obvious. That would also explain that. So you have dinosaurs, the long life of human beings in the Bible, and the flood, all pretty much, and the breaking up of Pangea, all in basically one theory. It pretty much could explain them all, just in one fell swoop. That me and the Reverend were outside a couple shows ago, just outside hanging out, and the Reverend dropped this on me, and I'm like, "Whoa, hold on, man, we got to record this."
Yeah.
This is more than just cigarette talk, brother. This is, Cara, I'm looking at you.
My mind is blown right now. Because when I was doing some of the research for today, I had seen that theory about the oxygen levels being really high, and so that's how people could live longer, and and that started to make sense. And I thought, okay, well that's but now when you bring that with the dinosaurs, with Pangea,
it's almost like a grand unifying theory.
Yeah. And you don't that's
it ties it all together in a really pretty bow. Is what it does.
Well, it's really popular with a lot of different groups. Also, you have biblical literalists on one hand.
Right.
You have people who are really big dorks for alternative theories of science.
You're right.
For people who study common mythology and a number of other things. Like, it really does a pretty interesting job of tying it all together.
Yeah, in just one theory.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes you wonder. And like I said, especially talking about some of the biblical, the ones who really hold true to what the Bible says, it does say that. I mean, I've read that myself, that there was a layer, or there was, I can't remember the exact wording of it, but it does allude to there being another layer of water.
I've seen it called the hydrosphere a number of times, but basically that's the gist of it, is that at some point in our planet's past, as a byproduct of its formation,
right,
there was a layer of water around it, and
I wonder if
now I have a question. So okay, so you have the ball of the Earth,
right,
and then of course we have water on the Earth. Right. So was there like a layer of air, and then over top of that was a layer of water?
Yeah,
so we didn't breathe water. Right. We breathed the air.
It was just something
between.
that was that was in or above the atmosphere.
Yeah.
That was, I guess, came from hydrogen and oxygen separating. I mean, I'm not a scientist by any means, but that's the belief, is that all it really did was it jacked up oxygen levels so high that it enabled long lifespans. But that at some point, what the theory says is that there was a what could have been an extinction level event or a cataclysmic event
maybe
where
like the meteors,
which could coincide with the extinction of the dinosaurs.
Yeah,
exactly.
Where this collapsed, and outside of religion or anything, this became the common thread behind every culture, mythologizing it to an extent.
And
which would make sense if we were all on the same continent.
Exactly. And then at that point, everything splits because you have so much water hitting this landmass. It's going to.
Plus, if you had, if it was something like a meteor, if it smashed into that one hunk of land, it's going to split it and throw it everywhere.
And then with that added pressure of the water dropping, it's going to separate it.
Yeah,
I mean that's an insane theory that it almost sounds too perfect to me. It almost sounds like it ties it together almost too perfectly.
Yeah,
I thought that too.
Yeah.
That was I'm like, I'm suspicious because this is too neat. Because things aren't normally that neat.
Exactly.
Sometimes the simplest answer
is the right answer. I used to tutor math. That was a job I had a while back, and I would tell a lot of my students, we would work on this huge long problem. It would come up to 4, let's just say, and they're like, it can't be 4. That's too easy. I'm like, why can it not be that easy? It really is, and it was. Once again, not saying, obviously nobody here knows, but it sounds good to me.
Yeah.
I can say that. It definitely sounds good to me. Now, Reverend, there's also stories, though, that there were giants that survived this event. Do you buy into that? Like, in other words, I'm kind of going into Goliath here. It's kind of where I'm.
Well, Goliath actually wasn't a Nephilim in the Bible. He was a Canaanite.
Oh, okay.
Or no, not a Canaanite. Crap, I don't have my book here with me. I forget it. But
he was not considered.
No, he was not a Nephilim.
Okay.
He was just a giant from among his people in the book.
So maybe like 7 foot tall, like Kane or somebody like that.
Exactly.
Somebody who's just extra tall.
The WWE Kane.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, I forget what
not Abel's.
Not Abel's brother.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
The Undertaker's brother.
Yes, the Undertaker's brother.
But that one always, just like I said, that one blew my mind. Now, Reverend, let me ask you, since we're still kind of talking ancient hidden history, the Anunnaki, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? What's your take on the Anunnaki?
Tell me yours first.
Well, I think it's interesting. I think it's a fascinating theory. Basically, an Anunnaki, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Ben, because I may be getting my my wires crossed here, but there's, I guess, a theory, a conspiracy theory.
Well, there's numerous theories from all over.
And one of the, I guess, more widespread ones, that Anunnaki were not of this earth, that they were aliens, and that they came down and basically, almost like the Watchers, there's a little bit of an overlap, sort of, with the Watchers mythology, that they came down to some of these civilizations, mostly the Mayans, if I'm not mistaken, and the Aztecs, possibly.
Somewhat. Like, Well, what one of the theories, like a really recent one, talks about is that these were a race of extraterrestrials who became kings. There's another archaeological, more basic theory that says that there was a god king at some point named Anu, and that his, he was both a king and considered a god,
right?
And his descendants were considered the Anunnaki.
I see. So they had this supernatural element to them,
right?
Pretty much, and they as well taught the civilization, agriculture, a lot of the same things.
Well, almost all kings from that period that we know about that were considered relevant enough to write about were considered both gods and kings.
Right. But the Anunnaki always kind of, that was another one that, kind of ties into planet Nibiru as well. That was another one of the theories that the Anunnaki was actually from Nibiru, and they traveled to Earth, when it was close enough to be traveled to and from. And that stuff, all that stuff is just fascinating to me.
Well, if we're going to talk about land masses splitting up, what do you think about Atlantis?
Ooh.
Well, it's interesting. So we're talking about this whole thing and the comet and everything. And one of the things when I was looking into Atlantis, I probably should grab some notes here. When I was trying to figure out, okay, do I think that Plato? Yes. Do I think that he was being literal, or was
Homer.
he just being?
It was Homer. Yeah, it was Homer. I'm almost.
Hang on,
I'm almost certain.
I gotta pull up my notes.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, so apparently it was Plato.
Okay.
So
Okay.
and Homer might have written about it.
It probably what it was is Plato took from Homer, probably.
Okay.
Or
is what
vice
I'm
versa.
thinking. Yeah.
So Plato told the story. It was about 360 BCE, and it's mentioned in two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. And his whole thing is that the founders of Atlantis, they were half human, half god, which kind of ties into that. But one of the things I started thinking about, is, okay, could Atlantis have been real? And yeah, I mean, I wasn't there. I'm not that old yet.
Yet.
Yet. But my thought was, what if so I think the thing about what Plato was saying is that it had happened like 9,000 years before his time.
Right.
Which is a very long time. It's a long
absolutely.
time now.
Absolutely.
Because that would make it like, I can't math. Lots of many years.
7,000 BC.
Yes, that.
Well, guys, I have some great news for you. There is a grand unifying theory to Atlantis.
Holy shit.
Yes.
Well, before you say that, let me just say, when you were talking about, half aquatic, half mammal types a little earlier, that was the first thing I thought of was Atlantis. That was what popped in my mind when you were just talking about that. So
Yeah, because I even wrote here, because of course, they're talking about, where would Atlantis be?
Right.
And people will say the Bahamas and people say Spain and all these places. Right. But my thing is, how will we ever know? Because the tectonic plates are shifting, and in 9,000 years, I mean, it might have moved, God knows how far away, or it could be in the Marianas Trench. I don't even know where that is.
Right. Well, I know the Reverend, you have a theory, because we've talked about this as well. And I'm like, hold on, we got to record this. And I just want to say one thing, Agency. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a little Maypop over here, because our guest, well, the Reverend's not a guest, he's a host. They have notes.
Oh yeah. No.
Me and Agency have, I think, taken 3 notes in about a year. I'm over here like, damn, man, we got to catch up, brother.
You don't take notes when you're
fuck,
a sponge.
I like it.
You like that?
I love it, man.
Yeah.
I love it.
That's the way I'm always here to learn.
Yeah. Oh, today we're learning. We're
So
learning today.
there's a grand unifying theory to Atlantis. Like I said, it's not quite as fantastical as the one about the flood, but in my opinion, it's maybe even a little more interesting in its own way.
And maybe more probable.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So when the original writings about Atlantis came out, they were very skimp to begin with. A lot of the theoretical and fantastical elements about Atlantis were later additions. That in the original writings, there were only a handful of real characteristics. We don't have, the viewer at home, if you want to make your own map.
Yeah.
This is where we get interactive.
Yeah.
This was a place that was somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
This was a place that was covered in gold,
Right.
but it had natives who were uncivilized, that went around with that were unclothed and had no use for the gold.
Right.
That is basically at the earliest we can trace it back in the thumbprint of the Atlantis stories. That's what it says.
Right.
Now, there was a lot that was added to it later.
Sure.
Like that it sunk, or that there was technology and all this.
The mythology, the
Right.
legend of it. Right.
And now we know that the story of Atlantis was originally told by two groups, the Greeks and the Romans. So at first, when you're hearing this, it sounds a little bit confusing, but you have to pull in things from all over the place. One of them is that we have found and discovered Solomonic coins in North America.
Right.
Coins bearing the image of King Solomon, in other words. If you've ever watched the History Channel, you know that we have found Egyptian architecture in Mexico.
Right.
And in all of Latin America, Central America, and South America. In the tombs of pharaohs of Egypt, we have found bananas and tobacco, which were both New World crops.
Right.
So when we begin pulling this from all over the place, we get a really interesting explanation, which is that these seafaring peoples, primarily the Carthaginians, who were, what's now Tunisia,
Right.
the Phoenicians, which is now Lebanon, Syria, and likely possibly Egypt too, all these seafaring people, that at some point they actually did circumnavigate the globe.
Right.
And I forgot to mention that another part of the story, the other part, which I forgot to throw in, was it said in the original writing of Atlantis that this place in the Atlantic Ocean is the size of Africa and Asia put together.
Right.
So let's sort of scale back
Yeah,
and look at the big picture.
Right.
If you were sailing around North and South America,
Yes, sir.
it would look like Asia and Africa,
Africa
put together.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Combine all the rest of the common myths about how we have Egyptian architecture right there. Solomonic coins, New World crops.
In Egypt.
And so a bigger picture begins to emerge that there's, in my opinion, a very strong case to be made that the core of the Atlantis myth is that the people from Carthage, Egypt, and Phoenicia did circumnavigate the globe, did interact at least on some level
Right.
with the people in North and South America, but they never bothered to pass on this technology to the Greeks and Romans.
Right.
Because this wasn't a big global
Like
culture, I guess, where people
right,
passed on knowledge to each
right,
other. I
right.
mean, if you discovered some shit, you kept it
To
private.
yourself. Right.
Give
But-
you the advantage.
Yes.
Absolutely.
But that what happened was that the Greeks and Romans heard about it as rumor
And right.
down the line.
And got mythology.
And it became a larger than life myth over time.
Right. So to bottom line it, your theory, and it sounds like a damn good one to me as well, that Atlantis is nothing more than North and South America.
Right.
What do you think about that, Cara Hayes?
I mean, that makes
Makes sense.
a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it certainly, it makes more sense than something falling into
Than an
the
island
sea.
sinking.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And it's possible. One of the things that I read was, that it's possible that that Plato was sort of modeling his discussion of Atlantis on what had happened at Santorini, which I think was like 3,000 or 4,000 years before he was writing, where it was like
That sounds right.
where it was like a big volcanic explosion, and then parts of it literally sunk into the sea because it just crumbled, and so they were kind of he was sort of trying to draw on something that people might be familiar with, but my God, I mean that I'm trying to wrap my brain around, because that really does.
We're going to have to make
Makes
this
sense.
show be filmed and visually interactive at
yes,
some point,
yes.
so we can string together a map.
And actually do
Yeah,
the whole
yeah.
visuals. Well, Agent C, I was going to ask you, what do you think about that?
there's also, you could argue the fact that Atlantis was actually just Earth itself, as far as that theory of, the water from below and above.
There you go.
And
which we just talked about a little earlier.
The pre-flood. After the flood, Atlantis is gone, destroyed.
Oh.
That's an absolute great theory, man.
That is. I hadn't even gone that route.
I haven't. So let me ask you, Agent C. So basically, what you're saying is, do you believe that the water layer could be part of how Atlantis? So in other words, Pangea, the one landmass would have been Atlantis. Hey, man. I mean, yeah, that's a hell of a theory, Agency. That's a hell of a theory. That now
for something to live, between water masses,
and it would make sense to think that it went underwater,
right?
Because obviously it came down, and all the continents did split at this particular point. Now, me personally, I lean a little bit more toward the Reverend's theory. To me, that sounds practical, not as fantastical. It's not quite
of the Americas being Atlantis.
Right? Yeah. Yes. It's like I said, not quite as fantastic.
Well, to me, it just seems like there's too much stuff that ties into it well. Like,
right.
And I'm talking about when you tie in things from all over the place. Like I said, how there's Egyptian architecture,
right? Exactly.
In Mexico, in Latin America,
right. And you have the pyramids in South America as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
just works a little too, and how in the tombs of the pharaohs we've got New World crops too.
Exactly.
Of course, I have another theory about that.
Go for
it.
It's our theory.
Well, let's hear it.
Aliens.
Oh,
I'm not gonna hit out against that one at all.
No, I mean I do believe
because the tech.
Yeah. And the way these things were built and everything. Now, I will say I
know people laugh at that. It sounds like a joke, but honestly,
I think there was definitely something going on, whether or not that was extraterrestrials, interdimensional, or just technology that we have forgotten about. Mm-hmm. There's got to be something there to explain it. I mean, it could be aliens. I think it could absolutely be aliens. I think, once again, me and the Reverends talked about this. I think it's more interdimensional than outer,
Man, this is that's a
Yeah.
subject for a whole other show.
Yeah.
I love that whole interdimensional. Because of course.
We've talked about this,
and I've been starting to listen to stuff about the Mandela effect, and because that, just
that one got me. That one's got me, y'all. I don't even want to talk about that.
I'm not going to go deep into it, but I absolutely believe that. Like when it comes to aliens, like I don't believe in the extraplanetary thing. I think that there's interdimensional stuff, but yeah, I totally believe that.
I mean, science. Proves that there's things that we cannot see, that we cannot hear. Look at dog. I always bring up dog whistles. We can't hear it, but we know it works.
Fuck, dude. Einstein proved that there are at least 12 dimensions. At least.
At the very least. And that was back then. So,
yeah.
If there's 12 of me, I'm so sorry.
That means there's 12 of all of us, so jeez Louise.
God.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Like I said, my conspiracy theory this week has definitely been the Mandela effect. I experienced it, but we'll talk about that at some other point. That's been my big one, though. Finally, I crawled out of that rabbit hole about 3 nights ago, and I don't want to go back.
Yeah.
I'm good right now. I spent about 4 days in it.
I heard your thoughts on it on the last show you did. See, mine's been Columbine, like I told you about. And
right. Yeah. We'll get into that one as well.
At some point.
Yeah, that's another one. That's for something else down the line. Well, guys, I tell you, we're starting to hit about that halfway point. Is there anything that we want to go into and talk about before we go into the second part of our show?
Well, I do have a question.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm trying Yes. Okay. So we have what we consider the Bible. The one that you can go to the store and buy.
Right. Canonized.
So most of the time, that's basically like either based off of or is the King James Bible, correct?
Usually, yeah.
So were there?
There were a number of
other versions.
Oh yeah.
And was it just based on like who was in power at the time, and these are what I believe, so this is the Bible now, or like who determines what gets in the Bible and what gets kicked out?
It was the Council of Nicene, correct? Wasn't that?
Well, this is a very, very loaded topic, but to put it really mildly, I guess that in the aftermath of the first 2 generations or so after the life of Christ, like circa, AD 100,
Right.
I guess, you began seeing a number of splits because there were a lot of different groups who began claiming their own interpretation of the story.
Right.
Way more than we really understand. And a lot of it had to do with disagreements about what was the nature of Christ.
Right.
I mean, this is me really kind of going. I'm trying to just skim the surface of theology here. I mean, I can talk about it all day, but there would be, one group like the Pauline variant, which ended up becoming Western Christianity, I guess,
Right.
that believed that the nature of Christ was entirely divine.
Right.
I guess there was an Eastern sect which became the Syriac, the Maronite, the Coptics, the Ethiopian church, which believed that differing variations of the idea that Christ was both human and
Right.
God in a package.
Right.
And then there were others that believed that Christ was God to the nature that he only looked human.
Right.
There were others
right.
but the Ethiopians, for example, where we see the Book of Enoch as an authoritative text, the Ethiopians believed that Christ was what you would call the Son of God by adoption.
Okay.
Rather than being born God or
Right.
Born to a virgin.
Right.
They believe that there is a point in the story where when Christ is being baptized by John the Baptist and the text says that a dove
Yeah.
ascends from heaven and enters into him, that they believe this was the moment that Christ as a mortal man became possessed or became the living embodiment of the Word made flesh.
That, as a spoken
So they
John.
call it, right, so they call it that he was a mortal who became possessed by the Word and became the living embodiment and vessel of God.
At that point of baptism.
Right.
Which is which makes sense because that's always seems to be the moment for as far as have heard and can tell, that was the defining moment of Christ's life is when he was baptized.
Right.
From John the Baptist. There's always like pre-baptism and then obviously
And so when we talk about Bibles or different books being authoritative, for example, when you look at some of the different splits in religion that occurred, specifically like splits within Abrahamism, like when Islam came about in the 600s, there are a number of stories that when a person reads the Quran that will be immediately like identifiable, I guess, as having biblical precedents, like stories about Christ, stories about Moses, like
Right.
a lot of reiterations of or retellings of stories of the biblical prophets. But there's a number of twists that to Western eyes and people who grew up within Christianity look a little odd.
Okay.
And they'll say, okay, where did this come from? But what's important for archaeologists that I've always heard them say about the Quran is that it is probably the best example of what we would have to go off of what the Bible looked like in Arabia.
Okay.
Because when you look at it, that it doesn't make a lot of sense to Western eyes when you first read it, but when you take it in the context of what the Bible was like in Ethiopia and its proximity to Arabia, and you look at Ethiopia's Bible and their stories about emphasis on the human nature of Christ rather than the divine nature, or like only being a prophet,
Right.
or more stories, a lot of emphasis in the Ethiopian Bible about Ishmael, Abraham's son who was sent off, and this prophecy that existed within a sect of the Jewish people since the very, very beginning, that said, okay, because Isaac was the favorite son, but there was still a covenant made with Ishmael, that after that how would I say this? That the chain of prophets were going to be Jewish, but that there was going to come a final prophet at the very end of time after the Jewish Messiah, who would be from the Ishmaelite line.
Right.
And that there would be, you
Right,
get what I'm getting
right,
at?
right.
So there's a number of stories that when you take it within looking at the Ethiopian Bible and the one that existed, like the Syriacs and things, for example, that make a lot of sense when you start to
kind of breaking
look
them
at
down,
it because you
right.
see, okay, that's how this evolved.
Right, and how we get to what we have today.
Right.
Today, or even to the King James era, I would assume, by the time it got there.
Yeah.
That was kind of where we're at with it, so.
Yeah. That's sort of how that stuff evolved. I mean, like, we could almost do a show in and of itself about how, religion evolved over the course of the last 2,000 years, but you really have to look at that there's a lot more commonalities than we would see on the surface. It's just that with Western eyes and only seeing, essentially Pauline Christianity and then seeing, the largest segment of Judaism and the largest segment of Islam, we look at them and go, how did these quite evolve into each other?
Right.
But when you realize there are so many schisms and splits and texts that were left out all over the place that different groups considered authoritative or such and such.
Like the Book of Enoch, for instance. Right.
And then you see, like I said, the proximity of Ethiopia to Arabia. It's kind of easy to see how they do evolve.
Exactly. So, Karis, how does that pretty much, answer your question, what you was looking at? It's a pretty deep subject. Yeah, it's like you were just saying, Reverend, this is something we could have an entire
we really
series
sure.
on,
And I would listen to that all day because I have so little knowledge.
Hopefully after today you have a
lot more.
Perfect.
Yes.
Well, guys, do y'all want to go ahead and take a break and start moving in our second half, or does anybody? Do you guys want to say anything before we end this part of Hidden History before we go into the more modern Hidden History?
What you got?
Well, I'm going to take that.
I have a surprised look on my face because that's a lot.
I was going to say, I'm going to take it by your expression that we're probably going to go ahead and end this segment, and we'll be back. And before we do that, let's have a word from our sponsors. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. What's up, Puds? This is Jason from the Pudcast with Jason and Mike, and I'm here to invite you to check out the premier video game store in the greater Charlotte area, GameSwap, located at 112 Northeast Court Square in beautiful downtown Lincoln in the great state of North Carolina. Whether you're looking to buy, sell, or trade classic consoles and games like Nintendo, Atari, and Sega, or modern systems like Xbox One and PS4, GameSwap has you covered. And GameSwap is much more than just a video game store. T-shirts, comics, records, toys, collectibles, and much, much more all here. And don't forget to like them on Facebook. And hey, while you're at it, check out the Pudcast with Jason and Mike with a brand new episode dropping every Sunday. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and podcast.com. Music provided by Silence Is My Canvas. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back. Once again, I'm Thunderpud number 2. I'm here with your co-host, Agent C, Cara Hayes, and of course, the good Reverend Doctor. And we're about to go into the second segment now. Agent C, I'm going to turn it over to you, brother.
All right, let's take a flip of the coin and look on the darker side of history.
History is lots of darkness.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
And let's look at a man called Hitler.
Now, Cara Hayes, this was, when we first talked about you coming on the show, this is what you were talking about that you would like to discuss and come up here and give your take on. And this is something, Reverend, and I know you too are schooled on as well. So, Cara, I'm going to turn it over to you. And why don't you talk a little bit about what we're going into, and then me and Agent C will probably just kind of take a step back and just take it in.
So basically, there is a theory that says that Hitler did not kill himself in the bunker, that he did escape, and that it was a body double that was killed and burned and buried, and that's what the Russians found.
All of those true.
Yep. And so the whole theory is that he escaped to South America because I mean there were tens of thousands of Nazis, especially the high-ranking ones. They were able to escape from Germany in the years just after the war. I mean, people like Mengele. I mean, if there is a more evil human being on the planet, I think you'd be hard pressed to find him.
No, who was this person? I'm not.
So Joseph Mengele,
Dr. Death.
yeah, or the Angel of Death.
Okay.
So if you've ever heard the stories about somebody doing experiments on twins, or
Right.
doing experiments on people, like he would say, "Oh, look, you have brown eyes. Let's see if we can make them blue. I'm going to take a needle. I'm going to take a syringe and I'm going to fill it with blue dye and I'm going to inject that into your eye to
okay.
try to change your eye
I
color."
see. So he was.
He was a
Okay.
sick human being.
Obviously, I've heard of some of those experiments and things like that, but I wasn't aware of the person who was like. So, would it be fair to say that this was one of the main people over these experiments? One of the main, if not the.
Cara, have you ever heard the stories about there being isolated tribes in the Amazon that have blue eyes and blonde hair?
I have heard a little bit about that. I haven't gone down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, well, what the theory states is that there have been tribes, like I just said, that live in the Amazon that for all purposes are totally uncontacted by the outside world. And the big glaring thing about them is they have blue eyes and blonde hair, and this was in the landing zone for Mengele and a lot of the Third Reich guys, and that they were experimented on.
Yeah.
I've never heard that. This is brand.
I
new to
don't
me.
even know if it's true or not. It I've read it numerous times over the years, but it makes for something interesting to think about, I guess.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, because one of the things that I've found out is that of course Mengele and of course Eichmann, he's probably the more famous one that escaped, and he was later caught by Mossad and tried and executed, But so Mengele, living down in South America, he was continuing to do these experiments. I mean, he didn't just stop when the Holocaust or when the war ended. I mean, he kept doing it.
Well, those guys all believed in the extraterrestrial origin of the white race.
Yes, right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you the viral society.
Vril,
Vril.
but it was called the Thule Society.
Right.
Yeah, and it was believed that the white race or the Aryan race had origins in Hyperborea in the far north,
right.
And that there was an inner circle within Nazism. Like, this wasn't something that the public believed.
Right.
I guess, I mean, the public was a very traditional society. I mean, this was Germany.
Right.
But there was a core group that included Heinrich Himmler and a number of other guys who were almost like dorks for this stuff. They really believed hard in it. Like, they believed that the Aryan race came from a star system that orbited a black sun, which is where the symbol of the black sun comes from.
Is the swastika correct?
They also call it a sun wheel, but
right.
I can't illustrate it for you for anybody listening. But it's it's basically this idea that the Aryan race has extraterrestrial blood, and that all of the other races are what they would call in scientific racism terms, where they would call them mud races, meaning that they were totally earthborn.
Right, and that the Aryans had some sort of supernatural / extraterrestrial quality.
Yeah, and
to them.
that blonde hair and blue eyes were cores to it.
Right.
Because, there's a lot of things that on the surface don't make sense about scientific racism as opposed to the American variant.
Right.
Just basic, where skin color is the be-all, end-all
Exactly.
to it, until you kind of grasp this stuff. I guess, for example, Hitler was very, very into Indian culture.
Right.
In the Far East, and also he was a very big fan of the Persians and Turks and things. But he also hated Semitic people and Slavic people, which those groups are both whiter than the other ones.
Right.
But I mean, this is something that's all very tied into this deep scientific or scientific racist theory of the Aryan race.
Right.
And these other groups all having the swastika, they believed that the swastika was a remnant symbol.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, because I was going to say, I know that symbol has been used for centuries. You've seen it in a lot of different places.
Yeah.
So just to kind of add to that.
Well, the swastika symbolizes all kinds of things. It's hard to articulate the meaning to it, but essentially, one way I read, I believe it was Carl Jung who talked about it. Jung was a student of Freud who later ended up going in a more mystic direction with his ideas about psychotherapy, and he talked about the swastika as being a or the way he wrote about it anyway was that it was a dream symbol, but a symbol of waking life, of somebody viewing it within a dream. Okay. That's a very like poetic way of saying it, but it's basically his way of saying it is symbolic of everything a culture or people aspire towards.
I got you.
You know, you look at the 4 elements of nature, like earth, air, fire, water.
Right.
Winter, summer, spring, and fall.
Right.
The 4 seasons, north, south, east, west, and all of like groups of 4s, but the way they would bleed into one another. If you're visualizing the symbol, that's supposedly what it means.
I got you. So let me ask you this: what sort of evidence, or other than some of these tribes that have been found with the blonde hair and blue eyes, what other kind of evidence do we have that suggests that I think it's pretty popularly known that some Nazis did escape, but what about Hitler himself, though? What kind of evidence or theories?
Oh, it definitely wasn't uncommon for a leader to have a body double.
Oh, absolutely.
Or
Stalin had them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Saddam Hussein had them.
Exactly.
In more modern times,
Well,
but,
and say what you want about Hitler. I mean, he was no military strategist, but he wasn't a dumb person.
No.
So
No, not at all.
I feel
you can't
like,
do what he did
and be dumb. I mean,
Right.
he was very calculating
Right,
in
right.
what he did, and there's no way that anybody could convince me that he didn't have a plan B, plan C, plan D. And so, I think it's completely possible that he was like, okay, so if shit doesn't go my way, what's my plan? There's a really great, and of course, it's very condensed and very TV.
Right.
But there was a show on the History Channel called Hunting Hitler.
I never watched it, but I'm familiar with the show.
That was a great show. Right. That was actually the first introduction to me of this theory. Right. Besides, Hitler escaped, and I'm like, okay,
sure, whatever.
Thanks, National Enquirer.
Weekly World News.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Do you know the theory about this priest or like Vatican representative named Father Crespi?
No.
Can you want to go into
nope,
it?
You go ahead.
Okay. Neither of you guys know about
Mikey,
it.
I haven't heard about this one.
So there was a priest, or I guess you could say a Vatican representative. I don't know if he ever preached any kind of congregation in a way like we would rationalize it. But this was a guy who lived in the bases of the Amazon, right in the area between Brazil and Argentina. And basically his role was to guard an art collection of some sort. And this was way back away, like away from the public, like, in wooded areas, right. I guess. And there were a lot of rumors about this guy for years and years. And the story that I keep seeing is that around 1992, 93, this guy died. And the only name he was known by is Father Crespi. He was basically like a pretty mysterious figure. And when he died, you had millionaires and billionaires, all of them German, coming from all over the world to throw him this extravagant funeral, like almost a thing fit for a king.
A king?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
They have this grand grave or like mausoleum set up to him with an eternal flame that to this day is still swept weekly.
So this was for a lowly Vatican associate.
A humble priest.
Humble priest.
And
Quote, unquote.
his gravestone contains the words, or the epitaph. It says, "There are no words that can sum this man's greatness up in death, because there are no words that can sum up his greatness in life."
For a lowly Catholic priest in the jungle.
And there have been people who have seen this art collection that he guarded. There was one woman who worked for American intelligence whose father was an ambassador they were originally German, I believe, but her family came to America when she was a child. Right. And she had spent time around the inner structure of the Third Reich, I guess. And she, like I said, ended up getting a job for American intelligence, and she was interviewed, and she said, I would swear on my eyes on anything that was Adolf Hitler's art collection.
Oh shit.
Yeah, and so
Wow.
yeah.
Which I mean,
Yeah, we're all kind of just over here flabbergasted, for lack of a better term. I'm
which
speechless.
where,
on that.
I mean, what better place? I mean, who's going to suspect a priest? I mean,
Right.
there were priests in the Vatican who helped some of these high-ranking Nazis escape. They
Escape,
got them passports. They got them safe passage. And we're talking 2, 3, 4 years after the war.
right,
And one of the things they do know about Crespi is that almost no one ever saw him.
right.
That, I mean, he was
Real
very,
reclusive.
very squirreled away, very hidden, and all this. But
Maybe it was Hitler.
exactly,
That's what I was about
that's
to
the
ask.
common. That seems to be the common consensus, because what I was just about to say is the epitaph on his grave was almost identically worded to what the leader of when Hitler first died. The leader of Spain, the fascist president, had erected a grave to Hitler that contained that exact epitaph, but almost reverse. Like, I think the original wording was, there were no words that can sum up this man's greatness in life, thus there can be no words to sum him up in death.
Right.
Basically the same thing, just reverse. Just
Yeah.
a little reverse, a little play on word. And I know, Reverend, me and you both, and I think Agent say I'm going to speak for you for this as well. I think we all, and maybe even you, Cara, that we believe that people use symbolism, that they use things like this as
Yeah.
markers. I think we all do that. Even on our other podcasts, we would do that. Just put little hidden things in our artwork and things.
It's for
like
the
that.
people in the know.
Exactly.
The people in the know will
Exactly.
go, gotcha.
Better.
And there's that connection.
Now, let me ask you again. Did you say that this priest died in 93, 92, something like
Yeah.
that, correct? Wow. Which would...
That would be amazing. I mean,
Well, that because Hitler was born in 1889, so which, I mean, not that people can't live past 100. We know they can,
But
Yeah.
yeah, exactly,
especially if he's cloistered. But even still, I mean, there's quite likely that they were connected. If they weren't
Right.
the same, they were
had
connected.
they had a
were.
connection. 'Cause-
Now, there's also a picture though that was supposedly Hitler from the late 1950s, early 1960s,
I've seen that.
and he's an old man
Yeah.
in Brazil, and he's got a black girlfriend.
Yes,
Have you
I've
seen
seen that.
one?
Yes, yeah, and they put pictures. What I saw online, and granted it's online, but I was like, holy shit, there's a lot to that.
But we do have there was a couple million pages of information that was just declassified
Yep, FBI
a couple weeks
documents.
ago, and that was one of the big. There were several big findings. I mean, like, people are still combing through it online. But I mean, there were a number of things that came up that a lot of people already sort of suspected, like that Israel has fired on American ships before
Right,
in the past. A big one that it will. I'm only going to hit on that we'll talk about at some point, but that China apparently had successful experiments with ESP and
Oh, no shit,
telekinesis
really,
that we witnessed.
Okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
but
I didn't know they'd just done another release because
Yeah.
I knew about the one from a few years back where a lot of the Hitler documents were declassified.
this was just back in late February, I believe, or early March.
I didn't know.
And one of the big things that it classified and came out was that Hitler definitively got away to South America. That we had intel circa 1953, 54 that said he's living at the base of the Andes. We have dozens of verified witnesses. We have people who work for us who have witnesses. And we can't vouch for whether Ava Braun is with him. It doesn't look likely, but that he definitely made it.
And that was in these documents.
Yeah.
So let me ask you guys. So is it now pretty much known that I guess what I'm trying to say is that now the official.
I mean,
word?
it seems like it, but I mean, it hasn't.
Wow.
It's not going to change the history books. You can guarantee that.
Right.
Yeah.
But so this is interesting. One of the articles that I came across was a Smithsonian magazine article, and they were talking about Hitler is definitely dead. He definitely died in the bunker. We found a chunk of his dentures, and we took it. And the person who worked, the secretary for his dentist, she said, "Yep, those are definitely Hitler's." So. Boom.
Done and done. We're
Story
done.
ended.
Yeah.
Those are his teeth. Therefore, he died.
The secretary of the dentist says that was Hitler, so we all have to go with what the secretary of the dentist says.
Well,
Because yes.
we as America have our own
right.
variation of the story of what World War II was.
Right.
We like to teach school kids that it was the U.S. versus Germany,
Right.
and that everybody was supporting players. Like,
No, that's-
we were really kind of more like the Scottie Pippen to Russia's Michael Jordan.
Right.
Yes.
The Russians were the big
At the end of the day, whichever
we were very
side.
late in the game.
We
too.
were.
We did because it started in 39.
Yeah, right.
We didn't come into it until 41, and the only
You're right.
reason we came into it is because Japan bombed us.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, whoever side
So they say.
whoever side Russia was on was probably going to win.
Yes.
Exactly, because they're
Yeah.
the ones, that winner, the famous, what's it?
Stalingrad and
Yes,
all that.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. Now that's brand new to me. What you guys just talked about, these documents being released, it's brand freaking new to me.
No, I tell you, I started going through the last release of the Hitler documents, and some of it, of course, you have your people. There was somebody who wrote in who was, I think, either in California or New York. It was one of those big kind of cities, and they were like, "Well, I was at a hotel, and there was a gentleman sitting near me, and I'm pretty sure it was Hitler."
Right.
Yeah.
And they're like, "I need you to investigate."
Right.
Oh, okay. That's a little strange because I'm pretty sure he's not going to come to America,
No.
and he's certainly not going to look like
Yeah.
he did.
Hitler. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's going to shave.
He's
going
going to take off the little smush on his face.
maybe change his hair up a little bit.
He's
There's
gonna
going to be a
slick his hair back.
Something.
Yep. Yep.
All right.
Maybe do a mohawk. I don't know.
Something. Wouldn't that be wild to see Hitler with a mohawk? I'm just saying. That would-
Photoshop.
maybe in one of these other realities we were just talking about on the break. Maybe he does.
In one of our other realities, he got
Realities.
into the Sex Pistols.
Right.
Wow, guys. Okay, let's get
I
back.
think I think it had gotten to a level of that Elvis sighting
Absolutely,
Yes.
to
Bigfoot.
where it made a lot of people just groan.
Right.
It's like, oh, come on.
But it makes you wonder if it could be a misinformation type campaign. I know, Reverend, we talked about that sometimes. People, governments or powers that be will purposely feed you
Well, I don't
misinformation.
think. See, I don't think that. Even though these documents have been declassified, I don't think they're going to stop teaching kids that we killed Hitler.
Exactly.
Because
Right.
World War II has become such a cornerstone of this mythology we've created. Like, this is our, in air quotes, our good war.
That's our romance.
It was our. Well, we've sort of remade it as being a war for tolerance, which it wasn't. To begin
Right.
with, the Holocaust wasn't something we even learned about until the very, very end of it.
Right.
But we've created this mythology that World War II was, this is, we've all got to find the common good,
Right.
and we've all got to go in and, fight for goodness sake.
Defeat
So it
the
was
evil.
And that really wasn't what it was, but that is, we use that, again, to keep overusing this term, this popular mythology we've created to justify every future war.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. In other words, every war that America's entered into after World War II has been righteous.
Yeah, we have
Every
to pay.
single one of them.
Well, and you can even take it back farther than that because, if you look at the Civil War and, you look at, so in the years, almost immediately after the war ended, the South, and I live here, I love this place, but they came up with this lost cause mythology
Right.
that, they were... they were just fighting for their beliefs, and and so I think that happens with everything.
Sure.
You have to have that mythology because otherwise, what did you fight for?
Yeah, right, right.
So you need.
Are you the
that.
bad guy?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So I to me, I think that's, and I don't know if that's a strictly American thing. I don't read a lot from other.
We've given it a uniquely or distinctly American twist in the
Yes.
sense that not just every war we fought since World War II. Hell, every politician we've hit out since then.
Yes,
what
sir.
do we say about them? We say this
They're
person
Hitler.
is literally
They're
Hitler.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or
every president,
Which
man.
I
Every
can't
leader-
stand.
I'm
I cannot
with-
take that because it diminishes
Yes.
what
Who Hitler was and what he
yes.
did.
I
what he
asked
did.
somebody that
Yeah.
once. I was in a college class and I heard somebody say Trump is literally Hitler.
Literally
and so
Hitler.
I tried to flip it on them just to see what they would think. I'd say, so are you saying Hitler is literally as bad as Trump? And
Right. Right. Well,
It stumps
Did their
them,
head
man.
explode?
it does.
hold on.
It stumps them. I said, because if your statement's true, that should hold up.
It should be the same. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Now you just flipped the script on us.
well, Hitler made it over here at least once, and he actually had a huge following.
Oh, here in
Hugely
America.
support
Oh,
in
oh yeah.
America.
No, there was
Oh,
a
the Bund,
yeah. Oh yeah,
yes.
man. Yeah, there was a huge Nazi support for.
Oh,
for
very
him
much
here.
so.
Yeah, yeah.
Huge.
Especially in
Oh,
the
yeah.
years,
Leading
before we
up.
got involved.
Right, right.
You know, there were lots
Oh no,
of.
there were Nazi rallies and stuff happening here.
Well,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
if you look at the big ones, Henry Ford, Walt Disney, Prescott Bush.
Bush, yeah, there you go.
I mean,
and we haven't even touched on Operation Paperclip. No. That one, I mean, once again, you start talking about all these old, Nazi officers being brought in to basically
Scientists.
Scientists.
I mean,
yeah, yeah,
Werner
yeah,
von
yeah,
Braun.
yeah. Oh,
Hey,
yeah.
you were a good Nazi.
So come on over and start NASA.
We're just going to pretend that didn't happen because we need your science.
Right,
Right.
right. I mean, it's like I said, they all basically did start NASA. I mean, that was, the bulk of
Well, because I mean, it's scary to think, but Germany was much more technically advanced,
Absolutely.
technologically
Absolutely.
advanced than we were at that point.
well, and that's also partially why military strategists will tell you why Germany lost the war, is because Germany's reputation had always been they were a nation of craftsmen or clockmakers. They were the
Yeah.
best at. They were
Precision.
the best at engineering.
Right.
They were a nation of very anal retentive people who
Right.
were obsessed with detail.
precision.
Right.
Yeah.
So they would build a tank, for example, that would be perfect.
Right.
Like they would build a perfect U-boat, a perfect, fighter jet, everything.
Yeah.
Well, America is not a nation of craftsmen. We are what you would call a fast food culture.
We're more quantity over quality.
Yes,
Push it out.
Push
get
it
it
out.
Yeah,
Boom.
so in the
Yep.
time Germany could produce, one tank that was like a 9 or a 10,
Right.
we could produce 3 tanks that were like
Five.
sixes or sevens.
Right, exactly, and just outnumber them.
Yeah.
Right. Now imagine if they had that kind of precision with our kind of numbers, we would be speaking German right now.
Well, that was a lot of the thought line that went into Paperclip.
right, to bring that kind of precision, because even today, Germans are still known to be pretty much excellent at whatever they
BMW?
do. That's what I'm saying.
Mercedes?
Mercedes, even Volkswagen. I mean, guys, you still see
Yeah.
Volkswagens from the 70s on the road.
I was going to say the only other one that's really
Yeah.
comparable is the Japanese.
Japanese. Yeah. There you go.
Well, and it's interesting that that there's really an overlap there because in Mein Kampf, Hitler's thoughts about the Japanese, I always thought were fascinating.
I'm not familiar.
Well, when there's a section in Mein Kampf where he wrote about the Japanese, and his opinion on them was, he was really fond of Japanese culture. Like he believed that they were the master race of Asia, that they weren't like the Aryan race, but they were a lower one that had guarded their breeding for so long and so many thousands of years that they had ascended to be like a parallel master race.
Really? I
But
had
only
no
the
idea.
Japanese, not other Asians, just them.
Just right.
So he believed that the way he phrased it, though, was he said that the Japanese are not people who invent, but they are the people who perfect.
I see.
So he
Gotcha.
believed that
That makes
because the way Japanese culture formed on being like an honor culture where you didn't really strike out and buck tradition, the way European culture honors people who try to strike out and do their own thing, that Japanese culture was originally based around if you came up in life, you were going to do what your father did and just perfect that, and
see.
what your grandfather did and perfect that, and so on.
and your
so
children
on,
will perfect
down the
what
line.
you were doing.
Yes,
Right.
that they were a culture of perfectionists.
Right.
So what Hitler said is that Japanese culture will not produce a telephone, but when a telephone exists, they will be the ones that will give you like an iPhone 10 for a current example.
Exactly. I see where you're going with that. That makes sense too. I mean, even in our modern history, you just use a great example right there from the telephone. That was, I guess, created by Edison, if I'm not mistaken.
Bell.
Or Bell.
Yeah.
Alexander Graham Bell.
I should have known.
Yeah,
that.
I think that there's something interesting to that, and one of the things is that when he's talking about that, it inadvertently comes off as, I think he meant it as like an observation on race, but it less comes off as that as an observation on the culture.
The culture, exactly, because not only perfectionists, but they're also traditionalists.
Yeah.
You know, it's a combination of both.
And it just has to do with the way honor cultures typically evolve, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
See, that's fascinating. I never knew that.
Yeah.
I didn't know Hitler's, because I'm not a history person at all. It was probably my least favorite subject in school.
Yeah.
I'm more of a math person personally, but that was one thing I was never.
history in school.
Well, that's true too.
I hated history in school.
And we came up in the Lincoln County schools.
I mean, it was
I don't want to blame the school.
everything was wrong.
Well, and plus I sucked in school anyway, so I don't really want to put it on the county, because that was
Right.
But the county probably didn't help either.
But yeah, that was basically the core of what I was saying, is that Hitler believed that the Japanese weren't Aryans, but that they were a parallel master race, and that he believed that that when Aryans and Japanese specifically work together, that it's beneficial for the entire world.
Everybody.
And so because of that, he had a huge fetish for the Japanese people.
And the Japanese were pretty brutal as well at this time. Like they were known for their brutality. I mean, that's why to this day, like, a lot of Chinese people do not like Japanese people, just given, if I'm not mistaken, guys, if I do say anything wrong, please correct me. But the way I understand it, that's why there's so much tension between Chinese and Japanese, the way the Japanese treated the Chinese before, the World War II.
Right.
And before their eventual defeat. But wow, man, that's insane. Well, let me ask you guys this: do you guys buy into the occult? Which we've already been talking about here, but how deep do you think that it really went with Hitler? Because according to a lot of experts on this stuff, they said he was entrenched and fanatical about the occult.
I don't discount it at all.
Right.
Especially in the upper echelons. They had those rituals and those kind of tendencies, I guess,
Right.
and I would absolutely believe it.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but Hitler kept a lot of those kind of people around him in his circles too. Correct, like a lot of astrologers and just overall New Age type, spiritual. See, that's something else that always kind of just really intrigued me, watching. I used to love watching those old shows, Hitler and the Occult, stuff like that. I used to love watching that. But once again, it was something, I was always like, well, is this real? Is this not just being, sensationalized for entertainment?
Well, there's a lot to suggest that Hitler was a traditionalist at his core, that he wasn't somebody who was really into all this shit that would have been considered out there.
Right.
There was a quote where he actually said, where he's asked about his religion, it's always been sort of assumed by a lot of researchers that, sort of like Thomas Jefferson, that Hitler was probably an atheist,
but
that he held on to the external surface of Christianity for popular appeal to the people.
Right.
But there's a quote where Hitler says that, if I'm not mistaken, it goes, I was born and baptized a Catholic, and by the grace of God, I'll remain one.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah,
okay,
but by all witness accounts, that it wasn't something he took very seriously at all.
Right. It was just just as part of his.
It's paying
persona.
lip service to the public.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which I think we have a lot of that in today's modern politics as well. I think we see that a lot today. So I mean, you could definitely know that was going on in that in that time as well.
But there's a fascinating quote by we had used him as an example earlier of Carl Jung, who wrote, like I said, he was a student of Freud, but he wrote a lot about both the occult and the Third Reich. And a quote I've always thought was so damn interesting ever since I read this was, he argued that what was actually going on in Germany had to be understood in mystical terms, that it was a reawakening of the pagan gods. Have you ever heard that?
I have heard
idea?
that, yes.
His quote, I got it pulled up, it actually goes, "We are always convinced that the modern world is a reasonable world, basing our opinion on economic, political, and psychological factors. But if we may forget for a moment that we are living in the year of our Lord 1936 and laying aside our well-meaning, all-too-human reasonableness, may burden God or the gods with the irresponsibility of contemporary events instead of man, we would find Wotan quite suitable as a casual hypothesis. In fact, I venture the heretical suggestion that the unfathomable depths of Wotan's character explain more about National Socialism than all of the reasonable factors put together."
No shit. Wow. So basically, you're taking it back to that, I guess, paganistic type beliefs.
It was basically like an idea that what the Third Reich was it was a giant occult ritual to reawaken Odin and
basically rule the world. So in other words, it wasn't necessarily about economics. It wasn't necessarily about the culture at the time.
Well, it is that on the surface, but
right.
at a deeper current level, that's,
like I said, this stuff is just mind-blowing to me. This is definitely mind-blowing. Well, guys, we are starting to kind of get toward the end of our show. Let's, this has been...
Wow.
Yeah, and it's gone by pretty quick. We still have time. We still have some time, but is there anything you guys would like to, before we do end today, is there anything that we do want to talk about, anything we definitely want to get out there?
Let's talk about the evolution of World War II to now.
Okay.
Do you think that the world we inhabit is basically just a giant aftermath of World War II?
I think so. I've always thought that. I've always thought that. I mean, there's definitely a pre-World War II kind of feel, that you think about, and then there's definitely post. To me, post World War II is when we had the superpowers. It was when Russia and America became prominent in the world. Because really, America wasn't as prominent in the world before World War II. We were more just kind of to ourselves.
Well, and if you look at 1945 as being like the true transition year between nationalist bodies being global superpowers versus international bodies being global superpowers. Like in the old order, say pre-1945, the world powers would have been, Germany, Russia, France, Britain, Japan, so on. Post-45, they're secondary players to NATO, to the UN, to the EU,
the Soviet bloc,
the Council on Foreign Relations.
And you just mentioned the UN as well. Yeah,
to where national bodies are, like I said, they're secondary backup players.
And I always thought it was pretty fascinating. Now I'm definitely starting to get way more into conspiracy, the more fringes here. I always thought it was kind of fascinating. You saw more UFO sightings. You start hearing more about things like that, these supernatural type, things after World War II. What do you think about that, Reverend?
Now we're going to go into the secret space program and paperclip.
Let's save it. Let's save that then.
We already did. We already did a show where we hit on it a little bit, where we talked about JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratories, and Jack Parsons.
Yeah. So we'll go in that a little bit more in detail at some point down the line. But that was something I've always found fascinating. But to answer your question, Reverend, yes, I do. I absolutely. Agency, what do you think, as far as a pre and post World War II world?
Well, and definitely as far as Israel being a main player.
Oh, hell, we didn't even bring that up.
Oh,
Yeah, exactly. Which was something we were talking about on the break, or during our break, about how Israel and how important, that is. We'll hold off on that as well, because, that's an entire series.
Well, I think, going back to the original thing, did Hitler get out? Did he live to whatever age
to a ripe old age?
Yeah.
Did he get to die of natural causes?
Because at that point in 45, from all accounts, he was in the worst health possible.
He was supposedly addicted to meth.
Yeah. And there's a lot of footage, of him, and knowing that, or with that idea in your head, it's like, okay, that makes perfect sense. Because you would see it back in the day, not think anything about it, but he was like, okay, he was taking, injections of methamphetamine every day, and you see how he would act in his speeches. He would always be fidgeting, always moving, always had to be doing something.
Well, see, one of the things that I've read about that specific topic is supposedly around the time he became dependent on meth, that he started being squirreled away from the public a little bit.
Right. They didn't want him out in the public eye as much because, he's tweaking the fuck out. All the time. I've always questioned the death of Hitler, even as a child. I'd be like, so this man who murdered all these people, who had an entire nation, almost, half the world behind him, would just kill himself?
You would just give that up that quickly.
Take the easy way out just like that? I
don't see it.
I don't either. I think we're all four can agree that has always sounded somewhat suspicious. But we don't know.
I know you're at that point. You're at that point in the war. You're what's happening.
You've lost.
You've lost the grasp.
The war. Yeah.
But do you let go of it that easily?
I mean,
and don't go and get away to fight another day.
And you can't tell me you don't have a way out.
Well, that's just it. Civil War is, one of my topics.
Right.
If you look at Jefferson Davis, okay, he knew that the war was, it was over.
You're right.
It was over. What did he do? He escaped.
Escaped.
He didn't go, well, gosh,
let me just go ahead and blow my brains out here. Yeah.
That's not human nature.
Exactly.
It's not human nature.
I agree. Not for someone in their position.
So long, cruel world.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. Mm-mm.
Not for someone in that position of power.
To me, it just never fit his personality or my perception of it.
That's it. That's
Yep.
what I was. That's what I was trying to put over. Just he wasn't a depressed. You know what I'm saying? It just seems like he would have a plan B, as you were saying earlier. You know, definitely.
Yeah, it just.
Now, one thing I did want to say before we ended, this is a very like a lot of stuff we talk about on this show. It gets controversial, you know. It does, and there's a lot of sensitivity because there's a lot of people out there who do not like this theory. You know, especially a lot of Jewish people. You know, they're like, no, this man murdered, 5 million. I believe it was close to 3 to 5 million.
It was roughly 6 million
6
Jews.
million. Yeah. Okay.
And then I think it's 11 million altogether when you include the Roma, the homosexuals, the quote unquote undesirables.
The thing that I've always seen with regard to that number is that there's question as to whether it could have been as low as 3 or 4 million or as high as 7 or 8 million, because towards the end of the war, one of the things that we sort of have to wrap our heads around is how many records were destroyed.
Right.
And the big thing, though, even bigger than that, I think, is that you had so many people who escaped to the Soviet Union.
Right.
And when a person escaped to the Soviet Union in those days and went behind the Iron Curtain, they were, for all intents and purposes, dead.
They were gone. Right.
They were disappeared from the world, and information about them didn't open up until almost 50 years later.
After the Cold War.
Yeah, but that seems to be the common consensus, is that we just don't know. Like at the low end, it could. At the low end, I've seen a figure listed as about like 3.5 to 4 million, and at the high end, I've seen it be about 8 million, I guess. But yeah, like I said, they just really don't know.
Right.
But one thing is for sure, though, which is fascinating, is that people have always sort of put it streamlined at 6 million.
It's kind of an average.
Well, for two reasons. The first is because that's the average, really in between. The second is because 6 million is a prophetic number. Did you know that?
No.
Yeah,
let's talk about that for a minute. Yeah.
Okay, well, there's a reading or an interpretation of Talmudic prophecy that says something to the effect of you will return, but with 6 million less. And they've always said that groups like that, when they were first, trying to get people to immigrate to Israel, that groups like the Rothschilds, who are behind it, they use that as a selling point.
Oh, shit.
Yeah.
I've never heard that.
No.
That's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Well, guys, I'll tell you what, before we wrap up, just to finish the point I was making with that, we don't want to put out there that we're discounting what Hitler did, or discrediting it, or trying to downplay is what I'm trying to say. We're not saying that, because I understand why people could get very offended by that. It's like, hey, especially the descendants of these people that were murdered. So I can see why that is a sensitive issue. No, Hitler died. It's closure. You know what I'm saying? And now you're trying to take closure away from people, but at the same time, like we say on here about every time we do the show, I think it's good to think of these things in alternate ways, and to look at from different viewpoints. And to me, the overall, I guess, the overall story of this hugely popular in his country and powerful, would just commit suicide at that sign of defeat without getting away, to me just doesn't fit the personality. It just doesn't.
Right.
Yeah.
Agent C, anything you want to wrap us up with, brother?
I think we're good. Definitely go. There is definitely room for more.
I've got a feeling we're going to have a Hidden History Part 2 at some point. Cara Hayes, I'd love for you to come back for that.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us today.
Was great.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.
This was fun.
I could do this all day.
Yeah, and I think I could speak for everybody to say that we would love for you to come back, especially if we do a sequel to this show, because and obviously, Reverend, as always, brother, as always, man, it's been a pleasure.
Pleasure to be here.
As always. Well, Agent C, brother, I think we're going to go ahead and shut it down.
Shut her down.
Once again, Cara, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
And as always, Reverend, thank you for being here, brother. It was a great show.
Indeed.
And, until next time, y'all stay woke.
This is a test of the emergency broadcast system. The broadcasters of your area, in voluntary cooperation with the FCC and other authorities, have developed this system to keep you informed in the event of an emergency. If this had been an actual emergency, you would have been instructed where to tune in your area for news and official information. This concludes this test of the emergency broadcast system.